To understand this first major step towards systematics, we'll touch on two issues. First, the cultural changes experienced by the Church during the patristic period. And second, the theological changes that resulted from these shifts in culture. Let's consider first the cultural changes that took place in the patristic period. One of the greatest changes that the early church faced after the time of the apostles was a movement of the center of Christianity from its home in Palestine to a new home in the Gentile world. This change was so decisive that Gentiles, rather than Jews, became the leading theologians of the church. This transition of leadership led to very significant changes in the ways Christians constructed theology. As Gentile theologians sought to minister the gospel in their Gentile world, they began to explain and defend their faith in ways that were relevant for the Greco-Roman culture at that time. They began to describe Christianity in terms of the Hellenistic philosophies of their day. Interestingly enough, Christians weren't the first ones to bring Scripture into meaningful contact with Hellenistic culture. Centuries before Christ, countless Jews had been scattered throughout the Gentile world. As they lived their Old Testament faith in that world, Jewish missionaries or proselytizers attempted to reach across the gap between Judaism and the Gentile world. Now, as these Jews reached out to Gentiles, they took two paths that Christians after them followed. On the one hand, many Jews Hellenized their faith so much that they fell into syncretism. They inappropriately mixed true Old Testament faith with pagan beliefs and practices. One of the best known examples of such syncretism appears in the writings of Philo of Alexandria, who lived from 30 BC to AD 50. Philo sought to minimize the differences between Old Testament faith and Gentile intellectual culture by treating the books of Moses as allegory, and by arguing that his Jewish faith was respectable because it was harmonious with classical Greek philosophy. At the same time, however, many Jews during these centuries found ways to minister legitimately in their Hellenistic cultures without seriously compromising their biblical faith. One great example of this kind of ministry was the creation of the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. Greek versions of the Old Testament were translated in synagogues throughout the Mediterranean world so that Jews and Gentiles unable to understand Hebrew would have access to the Scriptures. During the patristic period, Christian theologians went in these two directions as well. On the one side, many church leaders fell into Christian syncretism because they went too far in their attempts to Hellenize New Testament faith. They mixed true Christianity with pagan beliefs and practices. Some forms of syncretism had already risen in the New Testament church, but during the patristic period, a number of well-known unorthodox sects such as Ebionism, Basilitism, and Gnosticism developed in Christianity. On the other hand, while Orthodox Christian theologians resisted syncretism, they nevertheless found legitimate ways to minister in their pagan world by interacting with Hellenistic worldviews around them. As these true believers carried out Christ's commission to reach all nations, they expressed their theology in terms of contemporary philosophical and religious outlooks without compromising biblical truth. With these cultural shifts in mind, we should take a look at some of the ways authentic Christian theology changed to meet the challenge of ministry in the Gentile world during the patristic period. What were the general theological tendencies that emerged at this stage of Christian theology? During the patristic period, the dominant philosophical and religious stream in the Mediterranean world was an outlook commonly known as Neo-Platonism. The term Neo-Platonism covers a great variety of outlooks and represents a broad religious philosophy. It is called Neo-Platonism because it was rooted in the teachings of Plato, but also included new ideas introduced by philosophers such as Plotinus, who lived from AD 203 to 279. Although this religious philosophy was complex, we can summarize its central themes in terms of three issues: dualism, rationalism, and mysticism. In the first place, Neo-Platonism was dualistic. It taught a fundamental antithesis between the spiritual and material realms. In Neoplatonic dualism, pure spirit was considered good and pure matter was considered utterly evil. Although God himself was thought to be above both the spiritual and material realms, in his goodness, God spread his divine intellect, his light or logos, into the spiritual and material worlds. This divine force emanated from God and flowed throughout reality, bringing degrees of order and form, beginning first in the spiritual realm and then moving downward into the material world. This dualistic outlook had certain implications for the ways human beings were to live. People were said to be born in the material world, even imprisoned in the physical realm. But Neoplatonism taught that the highest good for human life was to seek God by eliminating all attachments to the material world. This notion of breaking with the material world in pursuit of God brings us to rationalism as the second emphasis of Neoplatonism. As people sought to overcome their imprisonment in the material world, they were to begin by focusing on human reason, the spiritual and intellectual capacity within each of us. Through careful reasoning and reflection, people could make great strides in lifting themselves beyond the evil matter that entangled them. As important as rational reflection was, it was just the beginning for the truly virtuous person. Neoplatonism called people to go beyond human reason and into mysticism. To reach full separation from matter and complete union with God, people had to move beyond their own human intellectual powers and to reach the heights of God himself. Because Neoplatonists believe that God is beyond all, transcendent even over human reasoning, in the end, human beings could have union with God only as they received mystical revelation that went far beyond mere human reflection. This spiritual ecstasy was supposed to come about by the inspiration of the divine light and word emanating throughout creation, and it was said to result in utter union with God, supreme happiness, the grand fulfillment of human destiny.